Our Craddock Lecturer for 2026 is the Reverend Dr. Chris Ferguson, a United Church minister, a theologian, a social justice advocate, and global ecumenical leader. Some of us will remember Chris and Susan as active members of Bloor Street. Susan as chair of the Social Justice Committee at the time when Chris was executive minister for the Justice, Global, and Ecumenical Relations Unit of the United Church of Canada. Chris then served as the World Council of Churches representative in Jerusalem and the WCC's representative to the UN in New York. He was the International Ecumenical Advisor for the Program for Ecumenical Accompaniment in Colombia, and then the General Secretary of the World Communion of Reformed Churches in Geneva. Chris's ecumenical and social justice chops were apparent from his ordination by BC Conference in 1978 when he became the minister rector of the United Anglican Parish of St. John of the Saguenay in Arvida, Quebec, and then became the joint Presbyterian United chaplain at McGill University in Montreal while teaching at the United Theological College. There's a theme here. Chris and Susan have jointly been active in anti-poverty work, community organizing, refugee advocacy, and human rights advocacy. And Chris is currently the international visiting professor at the Universidad Reformada, a university in Barranquilla, Colombia. I'm going to let Jean pick this up.
I went to Vancouver School of Theology all the way from Nova Scotia over to Vancouver. And in the class that I was in, it was actually a pretty amazing class, wasn't it, Chris? We were a bit of rebel rousers, and the prof sure knew we were around. So I knew Chris and Susan from way back in those mid-1970s. We lived in student housing together. There were a bunch of us that went at least once a week and sometimes twice a week. We went to a restaurant somewhere to eat, or we would eat in each other's apartments. We knew each other very well, and it was a privilege to be a part of that class. I just want to say one thing about Chris. From the window where I looked out from the student house, from the married student housing, I would often see Chris as he left the place and was going off to something. You've got to know about Chris that I don't know if he still does this, but back then he always had a book either in a pocket or in a knapsack, and he would read wherever he was, and he would just be walking, and sometimes in perilous places where there were stairs, and he was constantly reading and turning a page, and sometimes he even marked stuff in the book. And he was always like that, a man who loved reading and knowledge, but all for the sake of working for the most disadvantaged in the world. That was always clear. And Chris and Susan lived their lives, have always lived their lives with that in mind. And it is a great pleasure for me to be able to welcome Chris to speak with us today. He's chosen as his theme, Seeking Justice in a World Fallen Among Thieves.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you, Jean. I just can't believe how great it is to see all these familiar faces and some surprises. I'm looking at my former neighbor and colleague, Betsy, and so many other people that I didn't know I would see here today. So that is great. También quiero decir que entiendo que hay miembros de la iglesia que está formándose en español. Aquí están los compañeros, compañeras y compañeras latinos. This will be in English, but I hope we will talk later. Absolutely. And your phone. When I was asked about giving the Craddock Lecture, I impetuously chose the topic, Seeking Justice in a World Fallen Among Thieves. And I say that impetuously because given the world in which we find ourselves, where do you start? So I'll start like this. In 2004, the World Alliance of Reformed Churches gathered in Accra, Ghana. And something rather amazing happened at that General Council meeting, because it was the first time that this family of Protestant churches from the Reformed tradition actually found themselves in a position where the voice belonged to the majority of the churches of the world and not mostly to the European churches. Because the theme at the center of the conference was to respond. Remember, 2004 was really at the height of the impact after the fall of the Berlin Wall and all the changes leading to a kind of a new moment in the history, much of it the same, about economic exploitation of the powerful and the less powerful, of the North and the South. But now this was a system that didn't admit any alternatives. And the struggle was deep, and what we heard was the voices speaking of the reality of siblings from the global South, from the global majority, battered and suffering under the ravages of which they showed what was really a death-dealing economic system of globalization. All together with one voice, the community cried out, "We live in a scandalous world that denies God's call to life from all." From the perspective of the global majority, they critically analyzed the world situation through the eyes of faith and said the signs of the times have become more alarming and must be interpreted. And picking up the methodology of liberation theology, said the first thing we have to do is see the world as it is, use all the tools that can help us do that. Economic analysis, social analysis, political analysis, and then we have to come to grips with what we've seen from a biblical and theological perspective. And then more important, we have to decide what to do about it from the call of faith. And what they said was that the root cause of the massive threats to life are above and above all the product of an unjust economic system. And this system is defended and protected by political and military might, and that economic systems in and of themselves are a matter of life and death, and anything that is a matter of life and death is a matter of faith and of concern to the God of life. They discern that there is dramatic convergence between the suffering of the people and the damage done to the rest of creation. And in their biblically based and theologically focused reading of the global context, they place the injustice and oppression of the suffering people and planet within the actual systems and structures that make up the world order. To the great shock of many of the European and North American churches, there was a total shift to the focus of faith onto systems and structures of oppression and that which denies life, and away from a focus on privatization of the faith, concerns about worship and religion in its individual practice and a focus on what feeds and sustains life of the whole world. A shift we talk about all the time, but to see it actually in play was dramatic and shocking. They moreover said, we recognize that the enormity and complexity of the situation. We don't seek simple answers, but as seekers of truth and justice, and looking through the eyes of the suffering people, we see that the current world disorder is rooted in an extremely complex and immoral economic system defended by empire. And in using the word empire, they wrote, we mean the coming together of economic, cultural, political, and military power that constitutes a system of dominant nations and elites to protect and defend their own interests. We see the dramatic convergence of the economic crisis with the integration of economic globalization and geopolitics backed by neoliberal ideology. This is a global system that defends and protects the interests of the powerful. It affects and captivates us all. Further, in biblical terms, such a system of wealth accumulation at the expense of the poor is seen as unfaithful to God, responsible for preventable human suffering. And it has a name. It's called mammon. And Jesus has told us that we cannot serve both God and mammon. Strangely enough, I found this language a little conservative at the time. So let's fast forward 22 whole years. And through the blood-soaked lens of a global pandemic, environmental and existential catastrophe, omnicidal economic injustice, driven by racial capitalism, oppressive patriarchy, obscene and life-destroying inequality, which concentrates wealth and power in the hands of the very, 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 very few at the cost of the life and livelihoods of the very, 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 can I put another very many? We understand we're living in a time of oppressive nationalisms, supremacies, authoritarianisms, fascist tendencies, and a spirit of hegemonic competition between superpowers. An accurate description of a scandalous world that is unsustainable and unacceptable to God oddly feels like an understatement. You know how the people writing the news say, you can't make this stuff up? Who would have thought when I began to write this speech, all the things that happened after? Who would have thought that in one weekend of glorious excess that the United States Trump administration would lay claim to Greenland, invade Venezuela, kidnap the sitting president, put a board of peace to imperially rule over Gaza, made up of world leaders not worthy of the name. The exploitation of the many and avert itself for the greed and profit of the few is the defining fact of our life. In short, we live in a world fallen among thieves. Yes, it's a morally scandalous world, and to a large extent, none of us really know what to do about it. On the one hand, as the poet said wisely, human beings can only understand, can only take in so much reality. Can you really live at the edge every single day of understanding that the defining reality of our lives is destructive and harmful to human life and the planet itself? How do you live in such a place? Dorothy Sohle, a German theologian, when talking about sin, said, forget all these privatized notions. Sin is when life freezes over. Sin is where we become unable to mobilize the resources of empathy, relationship, and connectiveness, not because we're bad, but because we're so hurt. The post-colonial thinkers these days also now have introduced a concept, a neurological concept and a medical condition of aphasia, and have added the term social aphasia, which means that our woundedness has led us to the point that although we see what's happening, we cannot make the connection to find the words to describe our reality, like someone suffering from a stroke who can make those connections, can see, can understand, feel. And part of the whole scandal is always revealed through the particular. So you see this massive thing, but then we have specific truths that help us see again. So in a horrible way, COVID and the pandemic was an X-ray. It revealed what we already knew. We saw in the reality of vaccine and medical apartheid, how the very few got the benefit and the very many were left abandoned. And that revealed in its turn that we had all the time been living in a kind of global apartheid. And then, seized with this insight, we moved on without learning a damn thing. The particular of Gaza, alarming and difficult always to talk about, opens for us, through the words of Palestinian Christians, a moment of truth. The truth of displacement, occupation, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, a truth that we live seeing televised genocide, and we have been burned since 1948 with social aphasia. We could not name what we saw happening for many reasons, and none of them sufficient. Geopolitics, we have learned, are necropolitics, the exercise of power to decide who will live and who will die. Now they told us, the Palestinian Christians, it is a kairos moment where we're called to live faithfully in times of genocide. That includes finding our voice, to see the world disorder as it is, and to respond in faith. Looming over this service are the words of Habakkuk, who, as Doug appropriately reminded us, in the time of the Neo-Babylonian resurgence, which meant you had this empire, it kind of fell, and then it got big and nasty again. And in that time, we hear a prophet who had to do two things at once: face that there was a mighty empire threatening the peace and security of the whole world, ruthless in its military destruction, and at the same time, the society in which Habakkuk lived was unable to deal with this external threat because it lived a life dominated by internal injustice, impoverishment, exploitation of the poor and powerless, its own reaping what it sowed. The affliction that it cast on the poorest of the poor was now being visited on it by empire, and that the compass of justice had been long buried in the sand. The global situation is so dire, said Habakkuk, you wouldn't believe it if I told you. No one can escape being confronted with the global reality. But in and of itself, that does not cure us of our social aphasia. Knowing what's going on afflicts us more than it motivates us. Yes or no? No one can, whether we hear all the descriptors, civilizational crisis, poly-crisis, the end of the rule-based, or which, by the way, that Mark Carney happily tells us, forget it, the rule-based order is over. So now we have to, together with President Xi, create a new world order. And by the way, I will sit on the peace board and help dominate Gaza. We know that at global, national, and local level, things are going very badly, and the train is moving quickly down the track to worse. I have insisted on speaking not just of things falling apart, I learned a new word, which is jeremiad, not just that hand-wringing, continually talking, giving every speech with a long list of all the crises we're facing, but to be more specific. And that's why to choose the image of a world fallen among thieves, because it includes many things. The intentionality of robbery and disimpression. The thief doesn't do things by mistake or by accident, but intends to set out, in the words of John's Gospel, to kill and destroy and rob. And also, it indicates very clearly, as in the parable of the Good Samaritan, that there are social relationships involved and that there is a perpetrator who leaves the victim half dead. This just didn't happen. So in a recent meeting of the World Community of Reformed Churches, I was disappointed that one of their books was titled, talking about faith in a wounded world. Strangely absent was who did the wounding and who was being wounded. So the imperative of choosing the image of a world fallen among thieves is both because it is specific that the heritage of colonialism and the current system of economic domination is a kleptocracy, a rule by theft, taking people's life, taking people's wealth, taking people's cultures, language, and the last victim is hope. Through the eyes of faith, the stark truths of our situation are laid bare, and prophets like Habakkuk startle us into seeing that we live in a situation of global oppression, and this is counter to God's will. And one of the things that I wanted to do in reading these two long chapters of Habakkuk was to ask, and to all of us to say, where did you locate the axis of hope? So there's all these long verses. Did you see it? There's actually only one clear line where we're reminded that those who do justice through faith, but unfortunately the translation isn't great. It talks about righteousness and so on. My translation would be, the just who practice justice create the conditions for life. And this is in the middle of 27 other verses which talk about the destruction. It is the practice of justice that is the key, but not the practice of justice from any place, but the practice of justice in solidarity with the most destroyed. But Habakkuk tells us we have to look for it. We have to discern it. We have to seek it out. We stand in the watchtower and try to find out where it lies. So the scandal of the world is matched by the scandal of justice seeking. Why is that scandalous? Because the imperative of faith is that those who are oppressed, who are destroyed, the victims of the robbery, the crucified peoples, it is through them, with them, and where they live and die that hope is to be found. That the power of the resurrection in history is found precisely among the destroyed and the victims. I have to say I come from a place where the language of victimhood is used in Colombia. There are 10 million people who are registered victims of the armed violence. And the reason they prefer the language of victim to the language of survivors, the reason they reject understanding of resilience, is victims is firmly attached to the fact they have been victimized and that there are perpetrators who must be held accountable, which is not implicit in the concept of survivor. The crucified people, and we choose to talk about the crucified because crucifixion was a particular instrument created by empire to destroy those that resisted and dissented. It isn't any kind of awful death. It is a death that is created to kill hope. The crucified people are the authors of life and justice. They are not mere victims, but suffering servants of liberation, justice-seeking, sees its power in solidarity with the crucified. So if you took the whole of the United Church and everything that we're about on every level and asked to what degree, to what depth, to what commitment is our justice seeking in a world fallen among thieves, utterly oriented to walking, living, and witnessing with the crucified? What answer would we get? Now, of course, I need to say that this is a very heavy topic. So much that Doug Wellwood tried to do a more light touch cartoon in advertising it. These stark descriptions come after a great deal of description. And when Mary Sanderson asked me if I would consider giving the Craddock Lecture, it was clear that the topic could only be addressing the reality of our oppressive world, of genocide, through the eyes of faith, revealed through the suffering witness of the crucified people and the earth. But that seemed like pretty heavy, uncomfortable stuff, and it reminded me actually of a scene in the novel, I Heard the Owl Call My Name, about an Anglican priest that worked with the First Nations people, and he was clear that his imperative was to really lay out the gospel. In his first Sunday sermon in a small church was he laid everything he could about all the burdens facing the indigenous people. And as people came out, he looked everybody looking pretty grim, and he said to one of the elders, he said, how are you today? And the guy said, well, frankly, I was feeling pretty good till I heard your sermon. The other joke that isn't also necessarily funny that occurs to me is one of my favorite stories about this person from the city that got lost in one of these immense Saskatoon rural areas with all these farms around, and he was rushing in his car to get to an airport and got totally lost. And finally he saw a farmer, and he goes to the farmer and who's fixing a fence, and he says, I got to get to the airport, and he names the city, and I'm in a hurry, and what's the best way to go there? And the farmer thinks about this for a long time and says, you know, if I was going there, I wouldn't start from here. And putting it humorously, that's a little bit where we're at. That there is something much more radical required of us if we're to break our social aphasia and to take this on. When the U.S. Trump administration invaded Venezuela, kidnapped the president and all of that, and openly laid claim to the world's largest oil reserves, and boasted about it, Mary Sanderson sent a message asking if this meant I would have to totally rewrite my lecture. And the answer, of course, is more no than yes, because I was kind of already, yeah, but that it illustrates that, in fact, we are now in a situation where, because the gloves are off, because there are clear markers before us of the where and how exactly the pretensions of the powerful lie, that our choices become clear. So the ambivalence about the lecture was simply this: how much time do we spend in laying the general framework, and how much do we enter into specifics? And so I hope in the question and answer we will do more, and I'm going to say a little bit more now. But the fact of the matter is that dealing with the insights of the accurate confession do give us some guidance. That one is we have to actually understand the nature of the world order, that we are all defined, and that an object of faith is in fact not to center only on our own community, because there is no local reality in this moment in time that is not shaped and formed by the reality of the oppressive world. And the label of the world in which we live is one of geopolitical economic oppression defended by empire. Some of these things, to say them, would have sounded impossible, exaggerated, too flaky leftists for words many years ago. Now, these are categories that, as no other than Habakkuk reminds us, are necessary to deal with a world of self-declared kleptocracy, where the superpowers are now moving from a unipolar world to a world where, and you can see this through the Trump presidency, where they have announced that it is a little bit like in the book The Godfather, or the movie, right? That what is clear is that it is organized crime that will dominate all the spaces. The only question is how to divide up the pie. So that you now go to a system where, imagine there will be one super Don. It's okay, and Donald Trump being playing words, you didn't quite catch that, but going to, therefore, a world where now Trump is, quote, satisfied to project a world where it will only be the North American, it will only be this hemisphere that's under his direct control. That's his backyard, and he'll throw in the Middle East for good luck. And besides that, he will be prepared to do conflictual power sharing among the others. So we're in a time of contest between superpowers, and we're asked, actually, through the eyes of faith, to practice justice and not, in fact, to focus, therefore, by keeping our eyes on the crucified Jesus, is that our big shift now, our challenge as justice seekers, is to focus, to be with and on those people who are the victims of injustice in their search for self-determination and freedom, and not only to focus on, even though it sounded like a weak word, what a South African colleague of mine, now deceased, used to call the antics of empire, but instead to focus on the suffering and promise of the oppressed. Just in the last few minutes to say that we've had, Susan and I, and with our kids, I mean, I must say that one of the perspectives that I have is having had the privilege and the opportunity to work in many, many places of oppression. When my daughter did her master's degree in peace and conflict studies, I was amazed to read her little introductory thing, because she was asked what motivated her to do peace and conflict studies, and she said, it was because my parents drugged me to every conflict zone on the planet. And so from that perspective, understanding the world is where we are. I think many of us have been transformed by the work and witness of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, from Latin American theologies in the plural that stress the preferential option of the impoverished, the following of the God of life from perspective and in solidarity with the poor, the widow, the orphan, the sojourner, Korean Minjung theologies that center on the Minjung, the oppressed peoples, as the subjects, as authors of history, those who turn the world upside down and change it. Feminist praxis and theologies that have gifted us with the insistence of centering our moral imperatives in the struggle against patriarchy, rooted in gender justice, foregrounding the dignity and leadership of women in a capitalist world order that targets and exploits women's bodies, women's work, reproduction, all powered by ideologies of male supremacy. Feminist theologies and struggles have further gifted us with the understanding that biblical interpretation is not neutral and that all theology is advocacy. The South African Kairos document, written in the time of apartheid, exposed the role of theologies in promoting and maintaining systems and structures of oppression, denouncing from the perspective of the suffering majority, which they called state theologies, theologies that actually were the voice box of the oppressors. And we see that today in Christian nationalisms, in forms of Zionism, which are both Christian, Jewish, and Muslim these days. And I'll say more about that in the question period if people are interested. And they said that those explicit empire can't exist without these explicit theologies of support. But maybe the worst problem with theology is church theology, as they called it. Theologies that seek to take the middle ground, to see all sides, to give a version of justice and peace that supports the status quo, that refuses to push for change. And many of our theologies fall guilty to this. But what did they contrast it with? Prophetic theology, paradigm-shifting understanding that theology and praxis must utterly be in solidarity with the oppressed and sees God's mission in terms of systemic justice, upholding the life and dignity for all. The problem is, all this sounds like where we're already at, but we're not there. The confessions emerging from the Reformed branch of the Protestant family in the 21st century give us even more data. The Barmen Confession in the time of Nazi Germany. If Jesus is Lord, again, conservative language for some of us, if Jesus is Lord, it means Hitler isn't. If Jesus is Lord, it means that we cannot oppress people based on their ethnicity. If Jesus is Lord, the church has to take sides, but not with the powerful. The same with the Belhar Confession, also from South Africa, which called out church-justified racism, where people in the name of the Christian God would say that church unity is more important than justice. And then the Accra Confession, which we already said, gives us resources to say who it is that gets to name the world. and that clearly this is a question of dealing with the structures of oppression from the point of view of the God of justice, for whom the poor, the marginalized, the oppressed are in a special way God's people. We have all these resources, we have all of these instincts. Accra also reminded us that it is an indivisible connection in the destruction that global capitalism has brought between economic oppression and ecological oppression, social oppression, gender oppression, racial oppression. We have these insights into the nature of a world fallen among thieves, and we have this strong leading anchored in Habakkuk's clue that the practice of justice is the accompaniment, the identification with the community of the crucified. Very specifically, when we have a chance to go deeper in another moment, the issue of global inequality is at the center of all that we do. Could have you even imagined there would be such a thing as a trillionaire? And could you even imagine that less than 1% of the human beings control pretty well 50% of all the assets in the entire earth? This is not only scandalous, but unacceptable. And it has a name, kleptocracy, which I didn't make up, by the way. I live in Colombia, to end, I want to say, and the reality of Colombia is opening up for us the reality of the whole world. It is a country that is among where the biggest gap between the rich and poor, in competing only with Brazil, South Africa, and Namibia. At the same time, it has the richest amount of biodiversity anywhere on the planet, and at the same time where that biodiversity is the most threatened. It is into its well past its 7th decade of the most protracted and extensive armed conflict of a non-international nature. It has generated well over 4 million refugees, millions upon millions of internally displaced people, continues to be at the target of American and transnational extractivism, taking out the resources of the country. And it is a place where, as I had said earlier, 10 million registered victims of the armed conflict, and a society that is struggling to put victims at the center of the story of the authors as authors of a new reality, which in conclusion brings us to Gaza. I had the privilege, honor, and turbulent experience in December of 2023 of being part of a small group of people that answered Palestinian Christians' invitation to come and be with them over the Christmas period after they had failed to arouse enough solidarity to have an international ecumenical delegation come, a group of people from South Africa, and then a few of us from Latin America and one from the United States, did try to get into Gaza, and did succeed in going to Bethlehem, where Christmas had been canceled. And in the face of the inability of the global church to recognize the genocide that was going place, I had the most amazing experience of being among the few people who saw Munter Isaac, the pastor of the Christmas Lutheran Church, lay the figure of the Christ child wrapped in a keffiyeh among the rubble of brick and wood, and proclaim that that is where the presence of the living God and the movement of the Holy Spirit will be found, Christ among the rubble. In our discernment of seeking justice in a world fallen among thieves, I leave you then with this image. Did anybody ever participate or know about the evangelical movement of trying to discern God's will? And the catchphrase was, "What would Jesus do?" And did you ever have those little bands? You know, it said, what did it say? WWJD. In the hospitals in Gaza, during the very worst period, they had a new definition when they did the triage. And there was a new W that was put on the wristbands, and it stood for the phrase, "Wounded child, no surviving family." Challenge then of seeking justice in a world fallen among thieves. Do we have a witness that will speak to them? Amen.